Nobody expected such an extravagant charity event to hide a treacherous secret, but Chuck Norris felt the first sting of suspicion the moment he saw their glossy smiles and glowing promises. It happened during the coldest winter in New York's recent history, a time when frigid winds whipped through the streets and forced countless people without proper shelter to shiver on icy sidewalks. The city's homeless shelters overflowed, desperate for supplies, blankets, and warm meals. So when word spread about a high-profile online fundraiser that claimed it would gather massive donations to protect these vulnerable men, women, and children, the public's heart lit up with hope. People from all walks of life lined up to offer their money, thinking they had discovered a cause too important to ignore. But Chuck believed in verifying a cause before lending his name. He might have recognized the event's flashy marketing and impressive website, but something behind those polished digital curtains felt off. Therefore, he decided to do what he did best: pay close attention to the subtle details that others missed. The invitation arrived in a sleek envelope stamped with an elegant golden seal that read "United Hearts for the Homeless." It boasted a black tie gala, headline-making keynote speakers, and a promise to bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The letter asked Chuck to be an honored guest, a figurehead to galvanize supporters, and a voice to rally the city behind the initiative. Many celebrities and influential people had apparently signed on, and the letter made it sound as if Chuck's attendance would propel them to an unstoppable level of fundraising. He could have simply accepted, but he had encountered too many unscrupulous individuals who exploited crises to line their own pockets. He wanted to see more proof. His first clues surfaced when he took a closer look at the fundraiser's website. The page was dripping with emotional images of homeless families huddled in doorways, accompanied by bright red donation buttons that appeared on every scroll. But the photos felt oddly generic. Chuck had seen real volunteer groups who documented specific shelters or personally profiled individuals in need, but this site was different. He pressed further, noticing that the donation links took him to a third-party page that didn't display a clear nonprofit registration number. Chuck wasn't a digital wizard, but he had enough knowledge to sense something unusual. So he picked up the phone and started making calls, carefully digging into the background of these organizers. Every attempt to verify the legitimacy of United Hearts for the Homeless met with polite stonewalling or incomplete details. The phone numbers listed on the site led to automated messages. The addresses in the disclaimers pointed to large corporate buildings where multiple businesses rented offices, and nobody seemed to have heard of such a charity. Chuck's eyebrows inched upward in growing concern. He tried contacting an acquaintance in the state charity commissioner's office, but they couldn't find records matching the group's name. Meanwhile, local news outlets were championing the event, broadcasting how it would deliver an enormous sum of money for the city's freezing homeless population. The media never questioned the authenticity of the organization, perhaps enchanted by the swirling rumors of star-studded appearances. Chuck realized this could become a potential scandal if what he suspected turned out to be true. The city was on its knees from the brutal cold, and thousands of donors might soon be swindled. He decided to show up at the planning headquarters unannounced to observe the operation firsthand. He found an address from the official press release, scribbled on the invitation. It led him to a sleek modern building downtown, with tinted glass windows and a minimalist lobby that smelled of disinfectant. Chuck introduced himself at the reception desk, requesting a meeting with the so-called lead organizer, whose name was listed as Brandon Holt. The receptionist, clearly inexperienced, looked starstruck and quickly placed a call to an upper-floor office. Moments later, a woman in a sharp black suit emerged, her expression a mixture of excitement and unease. She introduced herself as Clarissa, the organization's spokesperson. She apologized that Brandon was out but offered to show Chuck around. Chuck accepted, keeping his expression calm while secretly analyzing everything he saw. The space felt too empty for a massive fundraising operation. A handful of employees tapped away on laptops in the open concept area, but they all seemed more focused on the glowing screens than on preparing for an event that was supposed to be days away. Boxes with promotional materials sat in a corner, still taped shut. The walls were bare except for a few printed posters featuring emotional images of people in dire need. Clarissa attempted to fill the silence with rehearsed lines about how excited they were to have Chuck's involvement, and how the event was shaping up to be a huge success. She mentioned that they'd raised tens of thousands of dollars in advance pledges. Chuck scanned the room, noticing minimal signage or typical nonprofit hustle. He asked for more details about how the money would be distributed to the shelters. Clarissa hesitated, pivoting to vague statements about partnerships and local outreach. Chuck knew from experience that legitimate charities often had specific lists of partner organizations, with clear details about how and where the funds would be directed. He kept pressing politely, but Clarissa grew nervous. Eventually, she guided him to a private meeting room, assuring him they'd be happy to share a transparent breakdown soon. She then excused herself, saying she needed to check if Brandon was returning. Alone in the room, Chuck scanned the walls. There were no whiteboards filled with donor data or staff schedules that one might expect in a busy operation. The entire arrangement felt staged. Therefore, Chuck decided to do a deeper investigation. He reached out to real homeless shelters across the city, especially those that struggled to keep up with the influx of people seeking warmth from the biting wind. Directors and volunteers told Chuck they had never heard from United Hearts for the Homeless. A few staff members had tried emailing or calling that group to request assistance, but they'd gotten no response. Meanwhile, that fancy website claimed to be funneling funds directly to these same shelters. This contradiction raised alarm bells in Chuck's mind. He then discovered that none of the legitimate organizations recognized the names of the Fundraiser's leadership. They recognized Chuck's name, though, because they had been hoping he would champion their cause. Chuck realized the brazen nature of the deception. A large sum of money was about to be collected through online campaigns that drew on the heartbreak of winter homelessness, but that money might vanish into the pockets of these phony philanthropists. In the background, hype for the event continued to grow. Social media buzzed with excitement, showing previews of a luxurious venue, claims of exclusive celebrity guest appearances, and short video clips from an unknown production company promising a star-studded night of compassion. Chuck felt the clock ticking. Thousands of donors might be on the verge of pouring their money into a black hole. So he reached out to a friend in local law enforcement, a detective named Lila Reese who specialized in white-collar crimes. She had worked closely with Chuck in the past on a community security initiative. He laid out the suspicious details. Lila wasn't surprised. She had encountered a recent rash of fraudulent charities popping up in states with harsh winter conditions. Though she lacked conclusive evidence, Chuck's intel gave her enough reason to suspect a major scam in the making. The next step was to track the flow of the online donations. But that was trickier, requiring specialized knowledge of digital forensics. Chuck got in touch with an old acquaintance, an expert in cybersecurity named Evelyn, who used to break encryption for private investigations. Evelyn agreed to help pro bono, especially since it involved saving critical funds meant for real homeless shelters. She soon confirmed that the organization's donation page was tied to a series of shell accounts. Whenever someone donated, the funds routed through multiple layers of encryption, eventually leading to an offshore account. If the fundraiser concluded as planned, an enormous chunk of money could disappear overnight, leaving donors stunned and the legitimate shelters out in the cold. Meanwhile, Clarissa followed up with Chuck, urging him to appear at the gala. She promised they'd have all the distribution details ready by then. Chuck masked his concerns, acting polite, and promised to confirm soon. He intended to attend, but for a very different reason than they expected. He quietly coordinated with Lila and Evelyn to set a trap. First, they needed more proof. Evelyn arranged a small team of hackers with law enforcement authorization to monitor the incoming donation traffic. Lila prepared to place undercover officers in the crowd during the event, hoping to catch the organizers in the act if they tried to finalize the theft. Chuck also looped in a few trusted journalists known for honest reporting, giving them hints that something big was brewing beneath the flashy veneer of the fundraiser. He knew that legitimate press coverage could be crucial for exposing the scam to the public once all the facts were laid bare. The day of the gala arrived with swirling winds and plummeting temperatures that turned the streets into a frozen labyrinth. The venue was a grand ballroom in an upscale hotel known for hosting expensive parties. Lavish decorations lined the foyer, with strings of silver lights and enormous posters plastered with the charity's branding. The event staff wore crisp uniforms as they welcomed guests who arrived in limousines and high-end cars. Chuck arrived wearing a simple black suit, ignoring the usual red carpet glam. The moment he stepped through the gilded doors, cameras flashed. People parted for him, murmuring about how excited they were that he'd come to support the cause. But Chuck merely nodded, scanning the crowd for suspicious faces. It didn't take long for Clarissa to hurry over in a dazzling evening gown. She flashed an overly bright smile and guided him to a roped-off VIP lounge, promising that Brandon Holt was eager to chat. Chuck gave a polite nod, letting her lead him past tables brimming with exotic appetizers, gold-trimmed centerpieces, and waiters offering expensive champagne. Across the ballroom, he noticed a swirl of elegant outfits, celebrities, and local luminaries laughing under glittering chandeliers, presumably unaware of the swirling deception beneath the surface. Clarissa introduced Chuck to Brandon, a man in his early 40s with a razor-sharp haircut, wearing a tailored suit that seemed designed for a magazine cover. Brandon oozed charm and gratitude, calling Chuck their star attraction and claiming that the fundraiser's donation totals were already skyrocketing. But Chuck watched Brandon's eyes dart nervously whenever Chuck pressed for specifics about how the night's collected funds would reach the city's battered shelters. Brandon rattled off half-baked answers about a distribution timeline, using words like synergy and philanthropic synergy in a forced manner that sounded more like a sales pitch than a real plan. Chuck excused himself, explaining that he had a brief speech prepared, then stepped away. He headed to a secluded corner near the event's backstage area, where he slipped into a vacant corridor. In the shadows, he spotted Lila, wearing a disguised outfit to blend in with the catering staff. She gave Chuck a quick nod, whispering that several large online donations were pouring in every minute, and Evelyn's team had tracked them to suspicious accounts. They only needed the final step, which was capturing the moment the funds diverted into the offshore entities. Chuck told her to be ready because the night would soon reveal all. Meanwhile, on stage, Clarissa took the microphone, welcoming the audience with grand flair. She extolled the virtues of compassion, painted heartbreaking images of people freezing on the streets, and praised the generosity of everyone present. As the lights danced across the crowd, Brandon took center stage next, reciting prepared remarks about the countless lives they would save, while the audience responded with thunderous applause. Chuck could hardly stand listening to these blatant lies. But he waited for the right moment, determined to strike only when he had ironclad proof. Behind the scenes, Evelyn signaled through a covert earpiece that she had identified the crucial transaction funnels. She said the aggregator site that processed the credit cards was about to forward the funds into the final offshore account. All they needed was to confirm that Brandon or another top organizer triggered the transfer. Chuck watched as Clarissa slipped off the stage, heading toward a small side office with a phone in her hand. That felt suspicious, so he quietly followed at a distance, noticing how she glanced around to ensure no one was watching. She ducked inside a room with a locked door. Chuck pressed his ear to the wall. Through the murmurs, he heard her excited voice referencing accounts, codes, and a plan to vanish once the final donation push concluded. Meanwhile, the crowd inside the ballroom roared with even more applause, thanks to a special musical performance from a local pop star. This spectacle was the perfect distraction for Clarissa and Brandon's scheme. Chuck stepped back, motioned to Lila, and signaled that they needed to move. Lila carefully positioned her undercover officers by the main doors, ready to block any escape. Evelyn indicated that she was moments away from obtaining the transfer records that would incriminate the group. Chuck decided it was time to step on stage. He approached a staff member near the spotlight controls, explaining with quiet authority that he needed the microphone for an urgent announcement. Because Chuck Norris demanded attention, few argued. Within moments, Chuck walked under the brilliant chandeliers, microphone in hand. The band faltered, letting the big screens flash Chuck's name in surprise. Attendees, both famous and unknown, turned their gazes on him, curious why he was interrupting. Chuck took a steady breath. He spoke about the bitter cold outside, how he admired everyone's willingness to open their wallets to help the city's homeless. But he continued with a sharp note in his voice, explaining that he had uncovered serious inconsistencies in the fundraiser's official story. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras swiveled to capture Chuck. Brandon, lurking at the edge of the stage, tried to hurry forward. Confusion splashed across his face. Chuck held up a hand for silence, detailing that he had personally reached out to the homeless shelters in question. None of them had ever spoken to United Hearts for the Homeless. The audience grew uneasy. Some exchanged worried glances, while others glanced at Brandon and Clarissa in alarm. Chuck said that trusted investigators had traced the donation platform to offshore accounts. Shocked gasps broke out. Brandon spluttered in protest, claiming Chuck was misinformed, that they had a plan to release the funds after the event. Chuck calmly turned to the big screens above the stage, nodding to Evelyn's hidden signal. A digital feed appeared, showing the real-time flow of donations, culminating in a suspicious final destination. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the data revealed the aggregator site routing money far away from the local homeless community. In that moment, Clarissa burst from the side of the stage, desperately insisting that it was a misunderstanding. But Chuck's expression never wavered. He laid out the evidence for everyone to see. Lila stepped forward with her badge, flanked by other officers, announcing that this operation was under investigation for fraud. The hush in the ballroom was electric. Some donors stared at Brandon and Clarissa with raw fury, outraged that they were about to be scammed. Others started snapping pictures or live-streaming the confrontation. Realizing they were cornered, Brandon tried to run, pushing aside a startled caterer, but an undercover officer grabbed him by the arm. Clarissa froze in place, wide-eyed as Lila approached her with handcuffs. She babbled about how they planned to donate some part of the funds, that it wasn't pure theft. But nobody believed her. The sense of betrayal in the room was palpable, especially among the big donors who had come expecting a genuine cause. As the organizers were led away, Chuck took the microphone again, urging calm. He apologized for the chaos and assured donors that every cent they had given could still be reclaimed once the authorities halted the fraudulent transfers. People admired him for exposing the truth before it was too late. Reporters rushed forward, peppering Chuck with questions about how he uncovered the scam. He kept his answers brief and straightforward. He was there to help the homeless, not to allow criminals to exploit them. Cameras flashed as stunned guests gathered their coats, still reeling from the abrupt turn of events. Chuck refused to let the night end in despair. He announced that he had contacted legitimate shelters and nonprofit organizations in the city, people who had been fighting on the front lines of winter homelessness. Therefore, he suggested that everyone in attendance redirect their donations to these real efforts. He told them he would personally ensure the funds reached those who needed them. To prove it, Chuck quickly arranged a direct line of donation through an established philanthropic platform that had documented partnerships with recognized shelters. Some donors who had shown up for the glitz realized that if they truly cared about the homeless, they'd donate again, but this time to a verified cause. The energy in the ballroom shifted. Instead of empty party talk, people congregated to figure out the best way to funnel resources to the right places. A few local politicians jumped on board, promising to help pass emergency measures to protect homeless citizens from the deadly cold. Dozens of volunteers from the city's shelters appeared in the hotel lobby after hearing the news, distributing brochures and explaining exactly what their facilities needed. Blankets, coats, non-perishable food, direct funding for extra beds. Attendees who wanted to save face or truly do good started pledging more money, determined not to let the scam overshadow the urgent crisis. Police cars arrived outside the hotel, lights flashing against the snow-laden streets, hauling Brandon, Clarissa, and a few other co-conspirators away. Chuck stepped outside briefly, ignoring the biting wind, to watch them load the scammers into the squad cars. Brandon glared at Chuck with undisguised contempt, but Chuck merely shook his head. The cost of betrayal was high, and Chuck felt no sympathy for people who tried to profit from the misery of others. Over the next few hours, the entire scene transformed from a fraudulent gala into a spontaneous, genuine fundraiser. The fancy decorations remained, but their shallow glamour was repurposed into a setting where dedicated volunteers had real conversations with donors about how to help. Chuck moved through the crowd, shaking hands and answering questions, explaining that if they truly wanted to fight homelessness, they should forge direct connections with established community programs. Hotel staff joined in, serving hot coffee and pastries to volunteers who had rushed over. It felt surreal, like a storybook twist where the darkest deception was exposed, paving the way for real compassion. By midnight, the event had raised a substantial sum under the correct channels. Lila checked in with Chuck, confirming they had enough evidence to bring charges for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft. The city attorney was already drafting statements for the press. Chuck thanked her for her swift action, relieved that the damage had been contained. Meanwhile, large screens flashed an updated total of verified donations now going straight to the shelters. People clapped in relief, some calling Chuck a hero for intervening. He never liked that term. He simply wanted to do the right thing. As the crowd thinned, Chuck met quietly with the directors of 2 major shelters who had arrived to help coordinate. They expressed gratitude for his vigilance because they'd heard stories of how donors become skeptical whenever such scandals occur. Chuck assured them they'd figure out a way to restore public trust and keep the momentum going. He asked what the shelters needed most urgently. One director requested thermal sleeping bags and portable heaters. The other stressed the desperate need for more cots and warm clothing for families. Chuck memorized every detail, promising he'd contact resource suppliers first thing in the morning to secure the items. Late that night, after the last donors trickled out, Chuck stood in the near-deserted ballroom. Hotel staff bustled around, tearing down the remnants of the false fundraiser. The chandeliers glimmered over half-empty tables and scattered decorations. The sense of betrayal in the air had dissolved into a quiet determination. Chuck felt the ache of a long day in his muscles, but relief spread through him. He could only imagine how many people might have lost their money, or how many homeless shelters would have remained abandoned if that phony fundraiser had succeeded. He stepped outside onto the frozen sidewalk. Wind whipped at his coat, biting into exposed skin. The city lights glowed against the snowy backdrop, a silent witness to the night's drama. He knew that not every scam was so swiftly uncovered, and he felt fortunate that they'd stopped these crooks in time. Before heading home, he made a quick detour to one of the nearby shelters. He slipped inside to see if it was still as overcrowded as he'd heard. Warm air enveloped him, tainted by the smells of many people in close quarters. Mattresses lined the floors. Volunteers bustled around, distributing cups of hot chocolate and extra blankets. A mother cradled her child in a corner, a tired smile on her face when a staffer brought them a fresh pillow. Another man, bearing the weight of a past no one else knew, sipped at a bowl of soup, lost in thought. The shelter director recognized Chuck and walked over, shaking his hand with genuine thanks. Chuck said no thanks was necessary. He realized that while the city had come dangerously close to being deceived, something good had come from the ashes of that false campaign. The public had glimpsed the real plight of homelessness, and a wave of compassion might be born out of the scam's exposure. That was the silver lining. The next day, news outlets ran the story everywhere. Images of Brandon and Clarissa being led away in handcuffs graced the morning broadcasts, but so did footage of Chuck galvanizing the crowd to redirect their contributions to authentic charities. Journalists praised Chuck for preventing a monstrous fraud. Some donors admitted they'd never donated to homeless shelters before. They had been seduced by the glitz, but now they planned to continue supporting the cause long after the winter ended. The city attorney spoke publicly, stating they would prosecute the scammers to the fullest extent of the law. She thanked Chuck for alerting law enforcement early enough to secure digital evidence that would hold up in court. Evelyn's name remained anonymous, but Chuck sent her a note of gratitude for her brilliant work. The next few weeks saw an outpouring of actual donations. The overshadowed charities finally had the funds to expand their capacities. Volunteers installed new heaters and ventilation systems in the shelters. They stocked warm clothing for children and set up extra beds. Some donors offered job connections for homeless individuals ready to work again. Chuck visited these shelters often, delivering supplies and meeting some of the beneficiaries face to face. He listened to their stories of hardship, determined to do what he could. He also used his influence to connect the shelters with local businesses, encouraging them to sponsor regular meal donations. In the end, the fiasco that almost tricked the city became a strange catalyst for real change. Everyone agreed it was a reminder that not every tear-jerking fundraiser can be trusted, and that verifying a charity's legitimacy is crucial. Chuck's name soared even higher in the public's mind, but he brushed aside any notion that this was about personal glory. He insisted that people who genuinely cared should use this momentum to build a lasting system that protected the most vulnerable. The city council scheduled a meeting to discuss better oversight of nonprofit events. Chuck planned to testify, emphasizing the importance of verifying any group that claims to champion the needy. His role wasn't limited to swift heroics. He wanted structural change to prevent future tragedies. Meanwhile, the families suffering through the bitter winter found a bit more warmth and hope. Word spread among them that Chuck Norris had saved the day when a shady organization tried to profit off their suffering. Those living on the streets might never meet him face to face, but they felt the impact as newly funded programs began handing out better supplies, meal tokens, and safe night shelters. Brandon Holt and Clarissa eventually faced a trial that led to harsh sentences. Their claims that they intended to distribute part of the funds fell flat. Evidence showed they had a history of setting up sketchy charities. Chuck never stepped into the courtroom, but he followed the proceedings quietly, wanting closure. He remembered how they tried to manipulate the public's compassion, and he was glad they'd been stopped. In a press conference shortly after the verdict, the mayor publicly thanked Chuck for preventing a monstrous exploitation of the city's goodwill. Chuck used the opportunity to urge citizens to continue donating responsibly. He challenged them not to let this fraud discourage them from caring, but rather to do their homework and direct their generosity to verified organizations. Local business owners who had been approached by Brandon's group felt a mixture of relief and anger. Some had almost sunk large sums into the fake fundraiser, hoping for positive publicity. Now they pledged to help the real shelters instead. Chuck's phone rang constantly after that.